Welcome to The Accidental Trainer, a podcast where you'll hear firsthand stories and tips on how to start and grow your training career.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of A2D Accidental Trainer Podcast. I'm your host, Alexandria Clapp, and today we have with us Siri Chilazi. She is a gender expert, senior researcher at the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School, and the co-author of Make Work Fair, Data-Driven Design for Real Results. Welcome, Siri.
Thank you so much for having me, Alexandria. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I am too. As I told you before we started hitting record, I have fallen into this trap where I try to cover an entire book in a podcast conversation.
It's hard.
My attempt today will be to let that instinct go, and we won't cover it all, and that will be okay. I'm really excited to talk with you about your book, but first, I do want to hear a little bit about your origin story. How did you land in your role, and what was accidental in your journey?
Well, actually, so many things. The biggest being the fact that I wound up in academia in the first place. Although in retrospect, it's not very surprising because I was always a huge geek, a huge nerd. I loved school and exams and tests and studying and learning. So in that sense, it's not a huge surprise. But right after college, I went into the private sector, worked in management consulting for 3 years. And that's where I came face to face with the gender inequity that still exists in workplaces. Unsurprisingly, right? Because it's actually my first full-time job. And in my case, at least, the education system by and large did a pretty decent job of insulating me from the worst manifestations of gender bias and gender inequity. But it all hit me in the face once I started working. So it really galvanized in me this desire to spend my life helping to close gender gaps somehow and ensuring that work is actually a level playing field for everybody. So when I came back to graduate school, that was kind of my mission and my agenda, is to figure out, okay, how do I learn more about this topic? Number one, but number two, what are the possible career paths in this space? And I really did not expect to become a researcher and an academic, but one of the opportunities that presented itself upon graduation was to work with Kathleen McGinn, a professor at Harvard Business School, on a year-long research project. And it just seemed perfect. So I said yes, without even thinking too much about what would follow after that 1 year. And it was really that research project that was highly applied. We were working with a large multinational company directly looking at gender equity at their most senior levels that made me realize this is actually exactly the space that I want to be in, the nexus of research, but also practice. So helping to generate knowledge about what works and what doesn't work to make the workplace a more fair place for everybody. And then making sure that we're bringing those insights to practitioners, to people on the front lines, whether it's in L&D, HR, DEI, or just in the business, and helping equip people with the concrete tools to do their work in more fair ways. And that's what I've been doing for the last decade.
I love that. And true to my form, I had a question saved for you that now I want to ask you about, because the subtitle of your book is called Data-Driven Design. So there are so many stats and figures and stories, case studies in here. I was wondering if there's one stat that you had to choose that stands out that made you rethink fairness. I know, total evil question, but something that made you rethink fairness, like really shocked you. So now I'm like, oh, was it that one that started this all off? Or maybe there's something else.
You know, there isn't one that started it off, but one that I love to share, because when I first learned about it, it actually changed how I approach fairness, is the example of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a law that was passed in 1990 here in the United States that mandated more accessibility, physical accessibility in public places. So in addition to a stairwell, you have to have an elevator. At the edge of the curb, you know, the sidewalk curb, there needs to be a smooth path for someone with a wheelchair, for example, to glide down. And at the point when this law was introduced in 1990, only about 4% of Americans had mobility challenges that made them direct beneficiaries of this law. Fast forward to today, number one, that fraction has tripled. So about 12% of Americans have a physical mobility disability that makes them direct beneficiaries of the ADA. But also, if we think about it more holistically, how many of us have ever been out and about with a bike it really helps not to have to lug your bike up a huge set of stairs. Or how many of us have ever been out and about with a baby in a stroller or wheeling our groceries in a cart? Or maybe you had an accident or knee surgery and you're on crutches for a while, or your leg is in a cast for a while. There's any number of reasons why actually all of us benefit from having access to smooth curbs and elevators and ramps. So a redesign of the physical environment that was initially inspired by the needs of seemingly a small minority. Well, number one, that minority, the numbers have actually increased, but we all benefited. It's a better, more welcoming, more accessible world for all of us. And I think there's a deep parallel to what making work fair looks like, which is when we design smarter processes and just frankly better workplaces, they're better for us all, and they're more fun and more rewarding for us all to be in.
I love this. It reminds me of the work that we did with Sarah Mercier. We worked on a book at ATD called Design for All. It is lots of accessibility and inclusion, good stuff for learning and development professionals. So this just feels like a continuation of it, and maybe in a bigger sense and maybe a more systemic sense in some ways. So let's jump in. Let's talk about your new book, Make Work Fair. You are talking about redesigning systems for fairness. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a high-level version of the framework that you and Iris created?
Yes. So as you mentioned, I co-authored the book with my dear friend and colleague, Iris Bennett, who's also at Harvard Kennedy School. And we're both passionate about helping individuals and organizations redesign how work gets done. And while the word design can sound really big, oftentimes this can be really small. So let me actually start with an example. One of the largest employers in Australia looked at their data a few years ago and discovered an interesting gap. When they had leadership positions open and internal candidates applied, among the majority of candidates, right, who didn't get the job, because only one person got the job, men were more than twice as likely as women to reapply for other leadership positions in the future. And from the organization standpoint, this was a loss because they, of course, have leadership positions opening up quite regularly, and they want the high potential internal candidates to stay in the pool because they've already been vetted and they've already been deemed to be quite high potential. So they were already emailing the top 20% of rejected candidates saying, we're so sorry, didn't get the job this time, but there's many other leadership positions becoming available. Please reapply. And they tested a super small tweak to that email, adding a sentence that said accurately, you were in the top 20% of candidates. Please reapply. And just adding that one sentence closed the gender gap in reapplications between women and men. So I think this is exactly a great illustration of the power of design, is making small tweaks to the things that we're already doing. No need to invest in costly, massive new programs and projects, trainings, even anything like that. Do the work that you're already doing, but find little ways to tweak your processes to make them better and fairer, both for the organization and also for the individual employees involved.
Oh my goodness. That is powerful. Really, really powerful. That makes me want to jump in my list of questions. And I'm having deja vu from conversations that I've had with Elaine Lynn Herring about when there's systemic change that needs to happen and change at the individual level. And obviously there's change that needs to happen at the systemic level. Let's address the elephant in the room. There's a lot of organizations that are quietly pulling back, or maybe very noticeably pulling back from anything labeled DEI, even if none of their core problems have gone away. If you're an L&D leader who is seeing this happening, they agree fairness matters, they want to do something about it, but their leadership is getting skittish or scared. How can folks still drive positive change without triggering political alarm bells?
It's an excellent question. The first thing I do have to point out is that the reality on the ground of what's actually happening is often different from what we perceive from the media. Because in media, the most extreme voices and actions tend to get a disproportionate amount of airtime. So I regularly speak to hundreds of companies and leaders, and I will tell you what I'm hearing on the ground is there's a lot less external talk, but a lot of the internal action hasn't changed. So I think it's just important to point that out and remind people that what gets reported in the media is not always an accurate reflection. But your question still stands. And I think this is where we have to peel back to ask ourselves, what's the ultimate end goal here? Do we just want to offer training for the sake of training? Or do we want to have women's leadership development program for the sake of being able to say we have a women's leadership development program? Or do we actually want to hire the best people at all levels? Do we want to make sure that women have an equal chance compared to men to advance? Do we want to see that reflected in who's getting promoted, who's getting access to the highest visibility projects, right? Things like that. And if it's the latter, then let's focus on tracking those metrics and let's focus on tweaking our processes, just like that employer in Australia did. So how do we evaluate performance? Do we see biased language cropping up in performance evaluations? There's software that can help us flag that and get rid of it. Let's track how long people spend on average in a given rank or in a given role before they get promoted to the next level. And let's analyze whether there's differences by function, by office, by gender, by race, whatever dimension you want to look at. And that's the essence of really making work fair, is it's not those programs that are kind of off to the side, but it's actually tackling the everyday flow of work and saying, how do we change the things that we're doing on a daily basis? Writing emails, running meetings, giving colleagues informal feedback, hiring new folks. How do we change those things ever so slightly to make sure that there's no bias unintentionally influencing those behaviors and those decisions?
Okay, I love it. I'm jotting things down. We're going to come back to meetings and feedback. I wrote down feedback twice because I will go back to that. You mentioned leadership development programs though. And so I want to jump to that because we have a lot of folks who are doing that right now. Maybe they're designing from scratch, probably not. They're designing or working on a new lift of their current programs, manager trainings. How do you recommend bias proofing these trainings so that managers become buffers against bias instead of accidental amplifiers?
So I'm going to invite everyone to take a step back, actually, to start and ask themselves the question of, why do we have this program in the first place? What are we trying to achieve with this program? And then once you know what you're actually trying to achieve, you will know what you need to measure to be able to evaluate whether the program is worthwhile or not. So if we're just spending all this time and money bringing women together to talk, and then our only metric at the end is on a scale of 1 to 5, how much did you all like this program? And we get, 5 out of 5, everyone loves it. Okay, that's one thing. But if our goal is to actually say, get more women promoted into leadership, or if currently women are promoted slower than men, to close that gap, well, then that tells us those are the metrics that we should be tracking. So my first point is you have to evaluate whether the things that you're spending money and time on are actually delivering the results that you want them to deliver. I'm particularly attached to that part of our book title, Real Results, Data-Driven Design for Real Results, because I think part of the problem in the DEI ecosystem is there's been so much well-intentioned activity that has gone on, but there's been very little measurement often of the outcomes that truly matter. So that would be my first point. And then once you have your goal in mind, let's say that we want to help more women get promoted. Well, then we have to understand what are the current barriers to their promotion and how could this women's leadership training program help overcome those barriers. So if we, for example, see that women tend to get lower performance evaluation scores than men, or as is more often the case, equal scores for women translate into slower advancement than men. So you might have a woman and a man who both get the highest performance rating, but somehow the man's bonus is higher and he's promoted sooner after that rating. Well, that's actually not a problem with the women at all or their performance. It's actually bias of the managers and higher ups who are making promotion decisions and compensation decisions. So the data doesn't lie. And if you look at the data, it will point you in the direction of where's the real problem that we need to solve. And most often it's not at the level of individual women or any other employee. It's actually at the systemic level of how decisions about things like work allocation, compensation, and promotions get made.
So this leads me into another thought about, you mentioned there's rightfully so, some backlash towards DEI programming because it has been ineffective. And maybe that's because they're not even defining what the specific metrics are.
Right.
Which I think there can be some uncomfortableness around saying explicitly out loud what you are trying to define. And you guys have some great stories and examples of programs that have worked. Thinking of the Atkins TV host or network, where they just focused on one thing, like men versus women who are contributors on the show versus all of these other intersectionalities that could sort of make more nuanced data, but also then maybe harder to measure and go after. I'm wondering if there's probably a long, it depends answer, but is that the most common reason why programs where you think it's a good program and it's good work and you set up with the end in mind, but you're still not seeing the change that you wanted to see?
So human brains do get easily overwhelmed. This is one of the insights from behavioral science. Think of something like walking into the grocery store and staring at a shelf of 3 varieties of jam versus 30. Is it easier for you to pick one jam out of 3 or 1 out of 30, right? It's much harder when we have so many choices and so many things to do. It slows down our decision making. It introduces a lot of friction. So I think that's definitely one thing that we have to keep in mind is simpler is often better. Getting people to start doing something new and something different, even if it's not the full vision you have in mind, is a step in the right direction. And then once you've made that a habit, once you've ingrained it into the organizational processes so that it's become just part of the way we do things here, then you take the next step forward and the next, and sort of build incrementally instead of trying to introduce 10 complicated changes all at once. So I think that's definitely one of the hurdles that a lot of organizations have stumbled upon. Another one, and I'll just make this point again about how making work fair is not a program, but it's a way of doing things, is a lot of the initiatives that we've invested time and money on have been separated from the everyday flow of work. So yes, it's so nice to have a speaker come in twice a year and educate people about something that they didn't know, or to go to a networking event once a quarter, or to do a training module online, once a month. But that's not your everyday work. Your everyday work is to go sell the product or respond to customer inquiries or do the financial analysis or create the slide decks, whatever it is that you do on a daily basis. So if we're really trying to improve culture, if we're trying to make sure that we actually have the ability to not only hire the best people, but grow the best people into the future leaders and then promote them, we really have to be looking at the everyday behaviors rather than those special events or programs.
That sounds maybe easier said than done, though, because then once you're doing it, you're like, okay, well, still, what is it that we want to go after? I want to go back to the uncomfortableness maybe sometimes around collecting data. It's an important part of this whole process. How can you collect and use data without it feeling invasive or politicized?
It's so interesting, right? That we couldn't imagine running our businesses without data. We don't question at all the premise that when you're, for example, launching a new product, you have to have a deadline by which you want to launch it. You do user testing, you do market research to have profitability targets and sales targets and market adoption targets and all of these things. And then you're tracking all of that. And if your sales reps are underperforming and not meeting their quotas, there's negative consequences. And then the top salespeople who are crushing it, there's positive consequences and they get taken on a special trip to Hawaii. Data is how we manage our core business. We couldn't imagine making smart, informed business decisions without data. So fairness is exactly the same. If we're going to get real results on fairness, we have to approach it using the same tools. So that's data, goals, incentives, tracking, transparency, accountability, all the same tools that we use to manage our core business. And I think that mindset shift is step one, is to say, of course, we have to collect all this data on our workforce because as leaders just keep on telling me, our people are our biggest asset. Our people are the critical enablers of our business performance. CEOs tell me if I don't have the best people in the right roles at the right time, performing at their best, right? Like actually doing their best work for us, we're not going to be able to meet our financial targets and have the high performance and market dominance that we're trying to have as an organization. So I think when we frame it in those terms and we see tracking data about people just on par with the tracking data about financial metrics or, product specs or other inanimate things, that helps to dispel some of the discomfort.
Yeah, there's definitely a line you had about don't treat fairness as different than the business imperatives
Exactly.
Okay. I jotted down some things that I wanted to make sure we went back and revisited, that you were giving examples that you can make meetings more fair. You can make feedback more fair. There's some other examples, but I want to start with those because I like that could be no matter what your seat of power is in your organization, maybe even you're an individual contributor or you just have less ability to do some systemic change maneuvering. Those feel like maybe easier wins or a place where anyone could get started. So can we talk about those?
Yeah, well, let's start with meetings. There's a lot of great research here. One study from Novartis, the Swiss pharmaceutical company, showed that when managers were invited in their one-on-one meetings with direct reports to actually speak less and listen more and turn over control of the meeting to the direct report and say, listen, I'm here to listen to your needs and concerns and I'm here to help. That actually increased employees' feelings of inclusion and psychological safety, but it also led to more frequent meetings between managers and direct reports because they presumably now found more value in these meetings. So I think that's an interesting lesson for managers or really meeting conveners is how do you provide the space just by literally talking less for people to surface what they need and what they're working on and what they're challenged with. Another interesting practice comes from a financial services firm that Iris and I worked with where, and this was actually even before COVID, but it's continued. They noticed that in hybrid meetings with some people participating in person and some people participating virtually, the virtual participants were really disadvantaged because they found it hard to get a word in once the conversation among the in-person participants really got going in the room. So they started a new norm that was piloted by a few teams at first, called virtual first. And it was quite simply that in a hybrid meeting, the virtual participants should all speak first so that they at least had a few opportunities to contribute before the in-person participants kind of took over. And what those first few pilot teams experienced was that it was so successful at helping to make sure everyone's voice got heard and all the best ideas actually surfaced for consideration, that then they started spreading this norm throughout the company. And because other people continued to see value in it too, it spread very quickly. So that's another interesting thing. One other thing I invite people to think about is the physical design of their meeting rooms if we are talking about in-person meetings. So a square table or round table is very different from a rectangular table, for example, when there's kind of that head of the table position where the most senior person sits and then everybody else sits further in the back. And maybe there's even an inner ring and an outer ring, or not everyone maybe has even a seat at the table and they have to stand along the back wall. All of these communicate things about hierarchy and whose voice is more important than another's, who should speak, who should not speak, when should they speak, right? So if we're trying to foster an environment in meetings where everyone feels confident and comfortable to actually express what's on their mind, moving to a more egalitarian arrangement, whether that's a circle or a square, or making sure that everyone gets to sit around the same table instead of there being an inner and an outer ring, can be really helpful. And again, those are just small design tweaks to something that we're already doing. I want to add one more thing, which is one of the dimensions of diversity that we don't talk about so often is introversion and extroversion. So some people who are more introverted prefer to think first and then speak, whereas others who have a natural preference for extroversion actually think through talking. So if we have a meeting culture where it's rapid fire, people are just talking, maybe even interrupting each other, reacting to things in the moment, that naturally puts introverts at a disadvantage because they never have the time to actually think and process and then contribute. So how might we level the playing field in this regard? Well, send meeting agendas in advance so people can prepare and know what's going to be talked about. If there's any materials that people need to familiarize themselves with, same thing, send them at least 24 to 48 hours in advance. And then maybe even give time as part of the meeting to say, let's pause for 2 minutes. Everybody write down their question or their thought or their main objection, and then go around and share in a round robin. Because again, you've supposedly tried to hire the best people. Now you need them to do their best work. You need them to actually contribute their brilliance, their ideas, their perspectives. It's your job as the leader or the meeting facilitator to create an environment where that can happen.
I love that idea. That's something that as a facilitator, you would do all the time. You give people a moment to do independent work, and then you come together and share. I'm thinking about, especially in virtual meetings and even in meetings that I've conducted where I want folks to brainstorm and have ideas, I'll ask for them to do it asynchronously to start so that it doesn't turn into groupthink, or that to make sure people have had a chance to do some thinking and ideating before coming together. But I've never in a meeting said, okay, everyone go on mute. Let's even turn your cameras off. It's such a small, simple thing that you could do that would take the pressure off. And realistically, sometimes you don't have time to whip up the agenda or the materials, or for whatever reason, there's going to be some circumstance where you could not give someone 24 to 48 hours of advance notice, but you can create that moment right there in the meeting.
Yeah. And I was part of a volunteer group where we did a lot of, this was inspired by COVID, but it's continued thanks to all this wonderful modern technology that we have available. We did a ton of brainstorming on Google Docs, right? Where everyone can go in and see what everyone else has written, contribute their ideas, and kind of starting the brainstorming on paper that way, generating a big list of ideas already, and then continuing doing part 2 of the brainstorming in person, where everyone has read through those ideas in advance, and then more great ideas emerge as a result of the back and forth in the room. It just led to much better outcomes than if we just brainstormed in person for 10 minutes talking, because more ideas were shared, more ideas were debated and considered, and everyone felt heard, but also the end result where we ultimately landed was superior.
Such an easy thing that people could start doing right away. And speaking of things that everyone should do right away, I think you have some advice in your book about how fairness, often confused with sameness. So let's say we're designing some program or making some offering, and we say we're just going to give everyone the same exact coaching package to be fair. Why might that not be the best approach, or how could it backfire? And what would be a tweak you would offer instead?
I think in most cases, leveling the playing field can actually help us treat everyone the same way. So let me give an example of a practice that's been popular recently, which is quote unquote minority recruitment programs. And I really don't like the name, but a lot of times that's what they're called. So the idea is that we have a regular recruiting program, and then we have people who specialize in finding underrepresented candidates, and they go through a different program. When I see something like that, my first question is, what's so wrong about our main recruitment program that it discriminates against, let's say, candidates of color so much that we need to create a separate program for them? To me, the real systemic solution in a situation like this is to redesign the main recruitment program, to debias it, to make it more structured, to collect the data. And based on evidence, we know exactly what to do. We know exactly what works and what doesn't work to debias recruitment processes, and then have everyone go through the same process and have an equal shot at having their brilliance seen. Again, it doesn't mean we hire everybody. We still put everyone through the same rigorous evaluation, but the point is we don't have to have 2 separate evaluations. So I think that approach is really productive a high percentage of the time. But to your point, there are situations where that doesn't work. And I think back to middle school, where I had a classmate who was blind, who couldn't see. But he was brilliant and otherwise was totally capable of being in the same classrooms as the rest of us. So what the school did, the school system probably, is they gave him special equipment that allowed him to essentially see what instructors were writing on the blackboard, or on, back then we had those transparency films that would project things onto a screen. So it allowed him to have access to what was being written, even though he couldn't see it with his own eyes. And then he had a special aide that accompanied him to all classes, helped make sure that he could navigate the stairs walking from one classroom to the next. But with those minor modifications, he was able to participate in all the same classes, take all the same exams, and otherwise go through the exact same schooling process as the rest of us. So I, encounter a level playing field. So I think that's what we have to ask ourselves in organizations is, do we have situations where some people are at such a great structural disadvantage that we have to provide, it's not a leg up, but it's actually level the playing field for them, such as was done for my classmate with the technology and the aid that then helps them to participate in the work on par with everyone else.
Okay, this made me think of another section that this might not necessarily pertain to all L&D professionals, but it might pertain to folks who identify as parents. And so I am going to throw it in there because you do address it in your book. How would you suggest we fix America's parental leave problem?
Yes, this one has a maybe unintuitive answer, and that is to provide gender neutral parental leave, which means the same parental leave for all parents, regardless of how a child comes into their family. But then that's part one. Part two is focus on encouraging men to take leave. Because empirically, when women have access to parental leave, they take it. They make use of it. Because there are still stereotypes and biases that kind of associate men with work and men as earners, whereas women are carers. Again, I'm not saying this is actually happening, but it's the stereotype, it's the expectation. Men encounter a stigma when they either take parental leave or want to step away from the workplace entirely to be the primary carer for a child, or if they opt for more flexibility so as to accommodate family demands. So just like the stereotypes about women staying at home harm women in the workplace, in an equal and opposite way, the stereotypes of men being the breadwinners hurt them at home and in their ability to participate in family life and household activities. The way to change those stereotypes over time is by having more men take the leave that they're allotted to, not encounter backlash or stigma for it. And when we start to see more of that in both in society at large, but in the people that we know firsthand, that's how it becomes normalized.
I love that as a new parent. Now I want everyone to offer that.
Exactly. And as long as women, in this case, continue to take more leave than men, let's be honest, it will hurt their career advancement a little bit, because every second that you're not at work, a male counterpart is, and they're doing more work and racking up promotions and bonuses. So the real way to level the playing field is to make sure that women and men both are at work, but they also both are at home. We know from extensive research that men want to participate in taking care of their children. It's just that they haven't had an equal opportunity to do it yet, but we're fortunately moving in the right direction.
I forgot if I set up that question and specified the American parental leave as it stands right now, because as I'm thinking about it, we do have someone on our team who is Canadian. And as my team just recently experienced my workload being kind of spread out for while I was gone. Thank you, ATD content team. You guys rock. I guess we were just learning that it's different in Canada. Like you get more time off. That's more typical. And also there's someone who comes in to sort of fill in the space while like junior sophisticated temp system to help fill in the gaps.
Canada is also a great example, actually, in this parental leave regard for men, because Quebec years ago instituted a so-called daddy quota, which was a month of reserved parental leave available just for men. So it's either you use it or you lose it, but it's exclusive to the father. And that significantly increased men's uptake of parental leave. And then, with this research, with having followed the data, having seen the impact, the government of Canada then implemented it more recently as a national policy.
That's really cool. Okay, thanks for the detour, our listeners. I'm going to jump back onto the train of maybe this applies to our L&D professionals. You talk about norm entrepreneurs. Can you describe what that is? And then how might that apply for one of our listeners?
I love that you bring this up, because norm entrepreneurship is something that all of us can do immediately today to make the workplace more fair without any special programs or training, or without really even any extra time. So norms, of course, are the shared but often unspoken understandings that we have about what kind of behavior is acceptable or expected in any given context. So think back to the last time you started a new job. On day one, HR probably gave you a manual that had some formal policies about things like vacation time and parental leave, perhaps, and confidential reporting. But those manuals never address the things that you actually need to do for your day-to-day work. Things like, do meetings start on time or 3 minutes after the hour? Is it okay to challenge a senior leader face-to-face? Or Do I have to speak to them one-on-one or maybe never challenge them at all? How do I get promoted? How do I know when I'm ready, right? These are all the questions that we have, but the formal manuals tend to never address them. Instead, we learn that information by looking around and seeing what people are actually doing. So we humans are very attuned to these norms that govern our individual behavior and our collective behavior. So a norm entrepreneur, quite simply, is someone who works to change norms in a positive direction. So let's say that your meetings, your team meetings currently have a culture of rampant interruptions. People are interrupting each other, being very aggressive. This happens in a lot of environments. And research does show that women are more likely than men to get interrupted. So if you feel this is unproductive and you'd rather sit in meetings where everyone gets to finish their thoughts respectfully, you might be a norm entrepreneur and interrupt the interrupter next time. And say, James, I look forward to hearing your point, but I'd love to have Alexandria finish hers, please, first. And then we'll come back to you. And that sends a subtle signal to everyone in the meeting that, maybe interrupting isn't the best thing to do. Alexandria was still talking. The right thing to do instead is to let her finish first. And if you do that once, and maybe next week, another colleague inspired by you does it a second time, pretty quickly, you've shifted the norm in your meetings to one where interruptions are no longer tolerated and are much less prevalent. So I invite all the listeners to think about what's one behavior that you would love to see change in your workplace? It could also be, meetings always start late, right? And you'd say, actually, I just love for meetings to start on time. Well, you could start to shift that norm by making sure that you start all your meetings on time, that you show up to meetings that are facilitated by others on time. And you could even make it explicit and say, hey, folks, I think it would be a better use of our time if we always started meetings on the hour and then maybe tried to finish 5 minutes early to give folks a little transition break in time to where they're going. So I'm going to be piloting this from now on in all of the meetings that I spearhead. And I really invite you to join me. And let's check in 2 weeks to see how we're liking this new way of working.
I love it. You're stealing my last question and giving homework to think about. So this is good because I was going to explicitly ask you, what if folks want to start with one small shift tomorrow to make their work fairer? What would you recommend? What can they start doing?
I'm going to recommend 2 things, if I may.
Yeah.
So one is norm entrepreneurship that we just talked about. All of us have ways to be a norm entrepreneur. I'll give you one that I do that I love. Anytime I'm invited to do something, speak at a conference, be a resource to a journalist, whatever it is that I can't do, instead of declining, I redirect that opportunity to somebody else. And I say, I'm so sorry, I have a date conflict for that conference, but here's 3 other incredible speakers on this topic that I would highly recommend. And that's an act of micro-sponsorship because I'm channeling opportunities to people who may not have gotten them initially, but who are highly deserving and excellent at what they do. Okay, so that's norm entrepreneurship. But the other home piece of homework, and actually it was someone in London at one of our book events that mentioned this as their takeaway, and it so resonated with me. And it is, all of us have a system that we can control. So find your system. If you're a senior leader in the organization, you control the L&D function. You have sweeping authority to change the programs, to change the content of the programs, start new ones, sunset old ones. But even if you're the most junior person on the team, you might be in charge of the marketing of those programs, choosing which photos and visuals to use or whose work to highlight. Those are all opportunities to make work fair and think about, are we being representative in how we talk about our work and whose work we highlight and who we're inviting to participate and the rules that we have in place about what the criteria are to take part in a program. So all of us, however big or small, have a system that we can influence.
This reminds me of the intro story, which was such a hook and actually had me leave my book immediately Googling it because I was so shocked to learn that the female crash test dummy wasn't actually officially created until 2022. But then once I got back to the book, you have a line just like that focus on the things that you can control. I mean, that's positive psychology too, locus of control. So I love that. That's great advice. I'm excited to see what our listeners do with your advice and recommendations.
Me too. I'd love to hear, what folks are inspired to try and implement and how it's working for them. So please, let's keep the conversation going.
Yes. Maybe we'll add some type of forum or survey so people can send you what they're up to. And as always, we totally didn't get to all of the questions and things. Like you mentioned sponsorship. I'm like, oh, there's lots of great things in here for folks who want to do behavior change, who are excited to improve the systems in their organization. But for now, let's jump back to you before we close out and tell us, what are you working on changing in your life? Are you growing? Are you learning anything?
I love nothing more than learning. That's why I love my job, because every day I'm learning. I'm doing research. I'm reading other people's research. I'm learning new things. But in my personal life, my husband and I have been learning Italian, a brand new language for both of us, for the last year or so through Rosetta Stone. And I have to tell you, not only has it been fun and very practical, because whenever we go to Italy, we're able to actually put it into use, but it's just reminded me what the best part of learning is, which is it challenges you. It causes you to see connections between things. At first, you're struggling with something. It doesn't make sense. And then comes that light bulb moment when things just click into place and you go, oh, now I get it. And then it's so concrete, and rewarding when you're learning new things and being able to put those things into practice right away. So it was actually a big reminder I haven't learned a new language in years other than this one. And it was a big reminder for me to always have a hobby that really is challenging me and taking me into a new realm where I'm in major learning mode, because it's so invigorating. Wow.
Well, I bet someone's going to pick up a new language, decide to start practicing after that endorsement. Cool. I'm so happy for you. Congratulations on your book. Thank you for making some time to chat with us. It was so much fun to learn from you today, Siri.
Thank you, Alexandria. The pleasure and the joy was all mine. Thank you for having me. And thanks to everybody for listening.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from the Association for Talent Development. Be sure to check the show notes for resources mentioned in today's episode. And if you found the show useful or insightful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague.